Berlin, November 1884. Inside a government building on Wilhelmstrasse, diplomats are arriving from some of the most powerful states in the world. Britain is here. France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Spain, the United States, Russia, the Ottoman Empire. Others have come too. Documents cover the tables, maps lie nearby, rivers, ports, trade routes, and enormous stretches of African territory are being discussed. At the center of the gathering stands German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the man who has invited the powers to Berlin. The conference officially opened on November 15, 1884, and would continue until February 26, 1885. Everyone has something at stake. Portugal wants its older claims around the mouth of the Congo taken seriously. France is expanding. Britain is determined to protect strategic and commercial interests. Germany, unified only 13 years earlier, has entered the colonial competition. And behind one of the most extraordinary projects in the room stands King Leopold II of Belgium, whose ambitions in Central Africa are rapidly becoming impossible for the other powers to ignore. But look around that room again. Who is representing Africa? There is no delegation from Asante, no representative of the Sokoto Caliphate, no Ethiopian delegation sitting there to determine the rules, no ruler from Buganda. No African political authority has been given a seat from which to negotiate the system these European powers are constructing around African territory. That absence is what makes Berlin so extraordinary. But there is something else almost everyone gets wrong about this meeting. The diplomats did not sit around one enormous map, take out rulers and pencils, and draw every border of modern Africa in 3 months. Most of those borders would emerge later through conquest, bilateral treaties, diplomatic bargains, and negotiations that continued for decades. The truth is more complicated and, in some ways, more disturbing. Because Berlin helped determine the rules under which the scramble would accelerate.
To understand what was happening in Berlin, we first have to forget the old colonial image of Africa as an empty map waiting to be filled. Africa already contained complex political worlds. Across West Africa stood the enormous Sokoto Caliphate. Asante remained a formidable kingdom. Dahomey and Benin possessed established institutions of government, military power, and diplomacy. In East Africa, Buganda had developed a sophisticated monarchy. Ethiopia possessed an ancient imperial tradition. Across Central Africa, numerous kingdoms, chiefdoms, and other political systems governed communities, controlled trade, and negotiated power. Southern Africa had been transformed earlier in the century by the rise of states, including the Zulu kingdom. These societies were not identical, and neither were their ideas about territory. Some possessed defined frontiers. Elsewhere, authority could weaken with distance, overlap with that of another ruler, or depend upon tribute, allegiance, kinship, and trade, rather than the rigid lines of a modern nation-state. That distinction matters. The tragedy was not that Europeans brought borders to a continent that had never known political boundaries. The deeper transformation was that European imperial powers increasingly imposed their own ideas of territorial sovereignty upon political worlds that already existed. And by the early 1880s, something was changing very quickly. European involvement around Africa's coasts was centuries old. Now Europe was pushing farther inland. Why did this crisis reach Berlin in 1884? There was no single reason. Industrial economies were expanding. European merchants wanted access to commodities and markets. Strategic routes mattered. National prestige mattered. And European governments were watching one another constantly, afraid that a rival might seize an advantage before they did. France was expanding its imperial reach. Britain already possessed immense overseas interests and wanted to protect vital commercial routes.
Portugal looked toward historical claims in Central and Southern Africa. Germany had only been unified since 1871, and Bismarck had once been deeply skeptical about colonial adventures, but German colonial interests were now emerging. Then there was the Congo. And the Congo turned imperial competition into something much more urgent. King Leopold II of Belgium had spent years pursuing a colonial empire of his own. But at first, he was not simply acting through Belgium. He built organizations wrapped in the language of exploration, science, commerce, humanitarianism, and opposition to the slave trade. Through the International Association of the Congo, and through Henry Morton Stanley's work in Central Africa, Leopold accumulated stations, agreements, and claims across an enormous region. The United States had already recognized Leopold's association in April 1884, before the conference began, and other powers followed during the diplomatic maneuvering surrounding Berlin. France was making competing moves. Portugal possessed claims near the Congo River mouth. Britain cared deeply about commercial access, and the Congo River itself promised something extraordinary to Europeans, a route penetrating deep into Central Africa. The danger was obvious. If these competing ambitions were not managed, colonial rivalry in Africa could become rivalry between European powers themselves. They needed rules. Not primarily rules allowing African governments to determine the future of their territories. Rules for Europeans dealing with other Europeans. And so, they came to Berlin.
14 powers participated in the conference. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, Spain, the United States, France, Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Sweden-Norway, and the Ottoman Empire. The gathering lasted more than 3 months under Bismarck's chairmanship. Think about what that meant. African rulers governed kingdoms whose populations numbered in the millions. African merchants managed regional and long-distance trade. African armies defended states. African diplomats negotiated with neighboring powers and with Europeans. Yet when European governments gathered to establish international rules concerning trade, navigation, and new claims on African territory, no African political authority participated as an equal party. And still, we need to correct the most famous version of this story. Berlin did not produce the finished political map of Africa. There was no moment when Bismarck unveiled every border of Nigeria, Kenya, Congo, Ghana, Cameroon, Zambia, or the dozens of states that exist today. Many of those lines did not yet exist. So if Berlin did not divide the entire continent on a map, what exactly happened there? The answer lies in the document signed at the end of the conference. On February 26, 1885, the powers produced the General Act of the Berlin Conference. Much of the document was not about drawing borders at all. It dealt with freedom of trade across a large, conventional basin surrounding the Congo. It provided for free navigation on the Congo and Niger river systems. The signatories committed themselves, at least on paper, to measures against the slave trade and to protections connected with commerce, missions, and movement. But 2 articles became especially important to the imperial competition that followed. Article 34 required a power taking possession of territory on the African coast, or establishing a protectorate there, to notify the other signatories so they could raise objections if necessary. Article 35 went further. It required powers occupying coastal territories to ensure the existence of enough authority to protect established rights, and, where applicable, freedom of trade and transit. Later histories often compress this into 2 words: effective occupation. But we need to be careful. Berlin did not create one simple rule saying, if Europeans occupy African land, they own it. The language of Articles 34 and 35 was narrower. particularly in relation to new acquisitions and coastal possessions. Later imperial practice expanded and developed ideas about effective control far beyond the literal wording agreed in Berlin. But the political message was still significant. A vague claim on a map was becoming less secure than actual presence. Treaties, officials, military posts, administrators, flags, occupation, control. For imperial governments, claiming territory and demonstrating authority were becoming increasingly connected. And that created a dangerous incentive. If your rival could strengthen his claim by getting there first, waiting became risky. The race was accelerating. And perhaps nobody understood this new world better than Leopold. While the delegates spoke about free commerce, humanitarian obligations, and peaceful navigation, Leopold's Congo project was receiving the international recognition he had desperately sought. There was no dramatic moment when the conference simply handed the Congo to him. The process was more complicated than that. Individual powers recognized the International Association of the Congo during the months surrounding the conference, helping clear the way for what soon became the Congo Free State. Leopold would become sovereign of this enormous territory in his personal capacity, rather than ruling it initially as an ordinary Belgian colony. Even the name would become a terrible irony: the Congo Free State. Because the humanitarian promises surrounding Leopold's project would eventually collide with forced labor, hostage-taking, violent coercion, and the brutal extraction of rubber and ivory. Berlin did not create every atrocity that followed in Congo, but the diplomatic system surrounding the conference helped give international legitimacy to the political project from which Leopold's regime emerged. And Congo would not be alone. Because after Berlin, the map of Africa began changing with astonishing speed. Put a map of Africa around 1880 beside one from 1914, and the transformation is staggering. Vast areas that Europeans had previously claimed only weakly, or not at all, now appear inside colonial territories. But remember the crucial point. Most of those lines were not drawn in Berlin. They came afterward. Britain and France negotiated boundaries and spheres of influence. Germany established colonies in East, West, Central, and Southern Africa. France expanded across enormous areas of West and Central Africa. Britain extended imperial control across Eastern, Western, and Southern regions. Portugal consolidated its possessions in Angola and Mozambique. Italy pursued empire in the Horn of Africa and later North Africa. Belgian control hardened across Congo. Borders emerged through agreements between European governments, treaties involving African rulers, reinterpretations of those treaties, military conquest, protectorates, surveys, occupation, and repeated diplomatic bargaining. Berlin was therefore not the moment when someone completed the map. It was one of the defining diplomatic milestones in the imperial system under which that map was created. And there was one enormous problem the lines on European maps could not solve. People already lived there. African societies did not simply stand aside while Europeans rearranged the continent. Some rulers negotiated, some signed agreements because they hoped European alliances could strengthen them against regional rivals. Some contested what Europeans later claimed those agreements meant. Others attempted diplomacy, and many fought. Samori Touré built a powerful resistance against French expansion in West Africa. Asante fought repeated wars against British imperial power. Dahomey resisted French conquest. The Sokoto Caliphate eventually confronted British forces. In German Southwest Africa, the Herero and Nama resisted German colonial rule. Resistance followed by catastrophic colonial violence. And then came one of the most important moments in the entire scramble for Africa: Ethiopia. In 1896, at the Battle of Adwa,
the forces of Emperor Menelik II defeated an invading Italian army. The victory destroyed the idea that European conquest was automatic, because there was a truth hidden behind every brightly colored imperial map. A signature in Europe did not magically create control in Africa. Europe might establish diplomatic rules about claims, but imperial power still had to be imposed on the ground, and Africans fought back. Eventually, European colonial rule began to collapse. Ghana became independent in 1957. Guinea followed in 1958. Then came the great wave of African independence around 1960, and through the years that followed. European flags came down. African flags rose. But something remarkable happened. Most of the borders remained. Why? Because newly independent African governments faced an extraordinary danger. If every inherited colonial border became negotiable, the continent could be pulled into endless territorial disputes. In 1964, the Organization of African Unity formally declared that its member states would respect the borders that existed when they achieved national independence. That decision was not an endorsement of how colonialism had created those borders. It was a recognition of what trying to reopen all of them might unleash. And so, boundaries produced during the long age of colonial partition became, in most cases, the international boundaries of independent African states. Not because the men in Berlin had drawn every one of them, but because the imperial process Berlin came to symbolize had transformed the political geography of an entire continent. Return to Berlin, February 26, 1885. The conference is ending. The General Act lies before the delegates. Signatures are placed beneath the document. Then, the diplomats leave. Bismarck returns to the struggles of European politics. Leopold turns his attention toward the Congo. Representatives travel back toward London, Paris, Lisbon, and the other capitals. None of them can know exactly what the finished map of Africa will eventually look like. Because, contrary to the legend, they have not drawn it yet. That is the final revelation of Berlin. The conference did not take a blank map and create every border we recognize today. Its significance was deeper. European powers had gathered to manage their own competition. They had created principles governing trade and navigation. They had established rules affecting new colonial claims. They had negotiated the future of European expansion in Africa without African political representation at the table. And once the meeting ended, the scramble continued. Soldiers marched. Treaties were signed and sometimes reinterpreted. Administrators arrived. Kingdoms were conquered. Territories were traded. Protectorates appeared. Surveyors marked boundaries. The diplomats negotiated thousands of kilometers away. Communities sometimes found themselves divided between different colonial administrations. And decades later, many of those colonial territories became independent countries. Now imagine the conference room one final time. The arguments have stopped. The chairs are empty. The diplomats are gone. The documents remain. What they did not seriously negotiate was the most fundamental question of all. What gave them the right to decide these things in the first place? The men who gathered in Berlin are long dead. Their empires have largely disappeared. But across Africa, the political geography created during the imperial age they helped accelerate is still with us. The famous story says that Europeans went to Berlin and drew Africa. The real story is more complicated. They did not draw the finished map. They helped write the rules of the race that produced it.